Bueno, muy buenos días. Les damos la bienvenida a este seminario sobre Hacia una política exterior con perspectiva de género, contribuciones desde las teorías feministas de las relaciones internacionales. Mi nombre es Soledad Capone y estoy a cargo de la Dirección de Asuntos de Género y de las Mujeres de la Cancillería Argentina. En primer lugar, quisiéramos agradecer al Instituto del Servicio Exterior de la Nación por patrocinar este seminario, y a la Universidad Nacional de Cuyo y al Consejo Federal de Estudios Internacionales, CoFEI, por brindarnos su apoyo. Asimismo, quisiéramos agradecer la presencia de miembros del cuerpo diplomático acreditado en Buenos Aires, autoridades de gobiernos extranjeros, representantes de las academias diplomáticas de América Latina y el Caribe, así como representantes del sector académico, estudiantes de diversas partes del mundo y organizaciones de la sociedad civil. Agradecemos la presencia de la jefa de gabinete del Ministerio de Relaciones Exteriores, Comercio Internacional y Culto de la República Argentina, Luciana Tito, que nos dará unas palabras de bienvenida. Muchas gracias, señora jefa de gabinete. Le damos su palabra.
Hola, buenos días. Gracias, Soledad. Felicitaciones por la iniciativa. Un gusto formar parte y dar comienzo a este seminario. Como parte de este gobierno y de esta gestión, tengo que decir que desde un principio el tema de la igualdad de géneros y avanzar en esa agenda ha sido una prioridad de la gestión que represento. Así fue que cuando llegamos al gobierno creamos el Ministerio de Mujeres, Géneros y Diversidades como una punta de lanza, entendiendo que la mirada de género tiene que ser transversal a todas las políticas públicas y a todo el Estado, y por eso la necesidad de tener un ministerio que jerarquice ese área. Durante el tiempo que estuve en la jefatura de gabinete, antes de desembarcar en Cancillería, el jefe de gabinete también presidía la mesa de transversalización de políticas de género, donde todos los ministros tienen una mirada integral y en todos los temas económicos, en los temas productivos, en los temas de exteriores, se tiene una mirada de género que es necesaria y que estoy convencida de que atraviesa todas las decisiones que se toman y que así debe ser. Y en esta línea también la Cancillería creó la Dirección de Mujeres y Asuntos de Género. Está el observatorio y el punto focal, ¿no?, tan necesario para cuestiones que pueden ir desde violencia laboral o cualquier otra temática que haga a la realidad que puede a veces tener una mujer en su ámbito de trabajo. Durante lo que va de la gestión, estuve inmersa en distintos temas de género que van desde justicia menstrual hasta las políticas de cuidado. Muchas veces hay un comentario que dice, bueno, pero ahora hay otras prioridades, o justo ahora, con este problema que hay. Y yo creo que sí, que es justo ahora, porque cuando uno ve, la pandemia atacó a todos, sin distinción de sexos, de clases, pero les pegó más a las mujeres que a los hombres. Y cuando uno ve, hay más pobreza en las mujeres que en los hombres. Entonces sí, justo ahora, cuando peor están las cosas, las mujeres somos las que más lo sentimos. Las mujeres realizamos más del 75% de las tareas de cuidado, de tareas no remunerativas. Tenemos peores salarios, peores perspectivas de futuro. Cuando uno ve la tasa de desocupación en la Argentina, las mujeres están 10 puntos arriba de los hombres. Cuando ven la falta de estudios o de acceso a los estudios, las mujeres están por debajo de los hombres también. Y cuando uno mira el Estado argentino, que ha ido avanzando lentamente hacia una igualdad sustantiva de géneros, uno ve que hay una paridad en los cargos civiles, en los cargos más rasos, y a medida que uno va creciendo jerárquicamente, la diferencia, la brecha se hace mayor por los hombres, el famoso techo de cristal. Cuando uno va a direcciones, estamos un poquito por debajo, subsecretarías un poquito, secretarías más, y ministros, rango de ministros, aún mayor. No creo que no haya mujeres capacitadas para ocupar esas posiciones, estoy segura que las hay. Pero creo que siempre es un poquito más difícil cuando somos mujer, por eso van a encontrar en mí, como les decía, una aliada para que con mérito, con capacidad de trabajo y con mucha responsabilidad, como las mujeres lo sabemos hacer, ocupemos lugares, porque cuando una mujer ocupa lugares, estoy convencida de que puede poner una visión que muchas veces, si no, no se pone sobre la mesa. Y me alegra saber que esta gestión hoy está en un récord de mujer con altos, que ocupan posiciones de alto rango, con más de un 37% de mujeres en estas posiciones. Falta, no estamos ni cerca de la mitad, pero aún así es un récord. Y bueno, yo soy nueva en esta agenda de la política exterior, pero creo que todos coincidimos en que Argentina está siendo bandera en la comunidad internacional por la agenda de género que tenemos, por el trabajo que venimos llevando adelante, y que hay un consenso, creo, común, que lo logramos las mujeres con mucha lucha, de que se escuchan las mujeres, de que tengamos voz y que ocupemos lugares. Así que desde mi lugar las invito a que sigamos avanzando en esta agenda, en ocupar más espacios, en seguir debatiendo, en invitar también a los hombres a debatir de estos temas y hacerlos parte. Y bueno, como les dije, acá siempre van a encontrar una aliada. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Luciana, por tus palabras. Estamos muy agradecidas desde la Dirección de la Mujer y Asuntos de Género por tu participación, que confirma la política de asuntos de género, ¿no? Y de mujeres en el Ministerio, y la importancia de tener este seminario. Bueno, ahora comenzamos con el panel. Tenemos expertas panelistas del más alto nivel. Estamos muy agradecidas por su presencia. En primer lugar, voy a hacer algunos comentarios con relación a cómo se va a desarrollar el seminario. Vamos a realizar 3 preguntas y primero vamos a hacer las primeras preguntas. Cada académica va a responder, tendrá 5 minutos. Y luego haremos una breve síntesis por cada pregunta que realizaremos. En caso de ser necesario, que seguramente ya lo saben, pero por las dudas lo vuelvo a repetir, pueden usar el canal de interpretación inglés-español y realizar las preguntas que deseen realizar en el box de preguntas y respuestas, en el Q&A. El evento está siendo grabado, lo vamos a después a alojar en el canal de YouTube de la Cancillería Argentina. Así que siempre que quieran volver a las exposiciones lo pueden hacer a través del canal de nuestra Cancillería Argentina. Si llegan a tener algunos inconvenientes técnicos con el Zoom, recomendamos volver a iniciar la aplicación y los admitiremos nuevamente. Bueno, a partir de aquí voy a empezar a hablar en inglés para presentar a las panelistas, y es muy probable que vaya y vuelva con el español al inglés, así que ténganme paciencia. Well, welcome to our distinguished panelists, and thank you for being here today with us. We have here today Dr. Cynthia Enlow. She's a researcher professor in the Department of International Development, Community and Environment, and affiliated with both the Department of Political Science and Women and Gender Studies at Clark University, Massachusetts, United States. We have also Mariel Lucero, professor at Universidad Nacional de Cuyo and director of the International Relations and Environment Studies Center from Mendoza, Argentina. We are very happy to have you here, Mariel. Then we have Dr. Heather Smith, professor of Global and International Studies at the University of Northern British Columbia, Canada. Also far away, but on the same continent, American continent. Thank you so much. We have Dr. Ann Towns, professor of political science at the University of Gothenburg, Sweden. That's also very far from Argentina, and we really thank you for having you here today. We really appreciate it. And then we have Marisa Zaleski, professor of international relations at Cardiff University, Wales, United Kingdom. Also, thank you so much, Marisa, for being here with us. Jackie True, she's from the Monash University in Melbourne. She was not able to be here with us, but we hope that there is another opportunity that we can talk to Jackie True from Australia, Melbourne. And she apologized for not being here today with us. Well, without further things, we will start with the questions, the first round of questions. And it is this one. What are we talking about when we talk about a feminist foreign policy, and what are its essential elements? We will start in alphabetical order. So Cynthia, if you would like to say the first words of these seminars, please go ahead.
Hi, everybody, and thank you, Soledad, and thank you, Luciana, for such a wonderful introduction. It's great to have you here as well. And it's fun to be on with various colleagues with whom I trade ideas. Let me just start. We're all going to speak very, very briefly to each of these questions so that we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. And that's a tough agenda for all of us to speak briefly, but we will. So let me just say something at the very start about feminist foreign policy. I think the most important part of it is feminist. That is, one really has to take seriously what over the decades, one might say at least a century and a half of feminist thinking. What does it mean to have a feminist anything, a feminist trade policy, a feminist domestic policy, a feminist academic policy? What does it mean to have a feminist academic policy or a feminist foreign policy? And that really requires one kind of to be part of the ongoing feminist discussion of power, of injustice, of militarism, of fairness, and equity. Feminism is not just about equality of women and men and people who don't identify as in binary ways. It's not just equality, it is equity. And equity means you have to, we, all of us, have to keep thinking about what justice looks like, which means we have to think about what injustice looks like. The feminist foreign policy means to get states on board, but states can't be just simply patriarchal states that all of a sudden start talking the talk, but not walking the walk, as we say in English, just talking the talk of gender equity. It means that states have to rethink what it means to be a state. And that means that states have to be more transparent, less militarized, more democratic, small d. And for me, that means that foreign policy to become feminist really means we have to take on the patriarchal character of day-to-day, ordinary, quote, normal, unquote, state operations. And that's very hard to do. So I will leave it at this point. I don't want to go on. I just want to underscore feminist, which means rethinking and re-understanding states' interactions with their own citizens and states' interactions with other people's citizens, women and men, and states' interaction with each other. And to rethink those as feminists is very challenging. This is not simply saying the right things in the formal settings.
Thank you, Cynthia. We will move on to Mariel Lucero.
Bueno, primero muchas gracias, agradecer a la Cancillería Argentina y en particular a la DIGER, que fueron los que me convocaron, digamos, a participar y a poder participar con estas panelistas, nada más y nada menos. Así que sobre todo les quiero agradecer a las panelistas que casi inmediatamente aceptaron colaborar, digamos, con nosotros en esta participación que tenemos en este momento. Entonces, comienzo. Y el tema es que esta política exterior feminista, cuando hablamos de política exterior feminista, estamos hablando de un concepto que surge en el 2014 en Suecia con un perfil, digamos, hacia lo que era una política pública. No surge en el ámbito académico, ¿sí? Han pasado ya 7 años de esto, y si bien hay contradicciones que pueden haber surgido entre la propuesta y la implementación, el punto es que hoy estamos hablando de política exterior feminista por la diversidad de países que se han autodenominado países con política exterior feminista. Y acá coincido plenamente con Cynthia en que hay un vaciamiento del concepto feminista que es importante, digamos, rescatar, y es hacia el cual, digamos, me parece que de alguna manera hay que replantearlo. Digamos, es una categoría hoy, política exterior feminista, que desde la academia no nos sirve para terminar de explicar qué es política exterior feminista. Digo, tenemos una diversidad entre Suecia y México de varios países y otros que se van sumando y que se van autodefiniendo de esta manera. Entonces, un poco la idea en esto, acá en Argentina, junto con Dulce Daniela Chávez y con Juan Martín Barbas, hemos planteado otras categorías que nos permitirían avanzar sobre qué interpretar o, digamos, indicar cuál sería el camino hacia esa política exterior feminista. Es como una utopía. Cuando uno habla de democracia, muchos países se consideran democráticos y sin embargo en las prácticas uno termina identificando elementos que no hacen a ese concepto. Con política exterior feminista pasa lo mismo, y en eso yo coincido o propongo, digamos, junto con mis compañeros y compañeras, esta política exterior con perspectiva de género y política exterior con perspectiva de género y agenda feminista. Esto nos permitiría ver otros, digamos, ampliar por un lado la inclusividad de a qué nos referimos con política exterior feminista, que en un principio, digamos, en lo que ha terminado de ser el uso de este concepto, son políticas que parecen orientarse solo a las mujeres y nada más, pareciera que los varones quedan fuera, que otras identidades sexogenéricas también quedan fuera, y por otro lado, pareciera que este concepto de política exterior feminista es un nuevo y poderoso polvo limpiador. Entonces, los varones quedan excusados, expían, digamos, de cualquier tipo de responsabilidades, y le venden a las mujeres el producto para que puedan seguir haciendo sus tareas en este sistema patriarcal. Me parece que uno de los elementos más fuertes del feminismo en su totalidad, la diversidad de feminismos que hay, es justamente el cuestionamiento, como decía bien Cynthia, hacia lo que es el patriarcado, ¿sí? Y hasta estereotipos de roles a los que nos tienen asignadas. Entonces, me parece que en esto una política exterior feminista debería orientarse a un cuestionamiento y una ruptura de estructuras. El otro punto que me parece fundamental es el equilibrio entre lo que es la política doméstica y la política externa. No podemos decir con una política exterior feminista cuando la tasa de feminicidios a nivel continental es una de las más altas. Me parece un despropósito y una contradicción muy fuerte que le dan poca credibilidad al Estado, ¿sí? Un Estado que, convengamos, es un Estado masculinizado y que también hay que deconstruir, ¿no? Este punto me parece que es fundamental. El otro tema tiene que ver con la no violencia, que es otro de los temas, digamos, importantes. Tiene que haber una redefinición de lo que vamos a entender por seguridad y por amenaza, y cómo eso se va a construir desde esa política exterior, con perspectiva de género, para mí, ¿sí? Que tiene que superar, digamos, no solamente lo físico, sino también lo simbólico, como mencionaba en la charla previa Soledad, digamos, hasta tiene que ser una superación de lo que es la violencia física, pero también la violencia simbólica, que puede estar dada en el lenguaje y que en castellano se ve mucho y es sumamente clara. Y por el otro lado, la importancia de la interseccionalidad, ¿no? Como elementos claves, me parece, para hablar de una política exterior feminista o hacia donde nos tendríamos que dirigir. Insisto, en la práctica, hoy por hoy, esa política exterior feminista yo creo que no está en ninguno de los estados que así se autodenominan, y me parece que están en otras categorías que es necesario desarrollar y trabajar para que realmente pueda haber una cierta, digamos, coherencia entre lo que se dice, lo que se propone y lo que se hace. Eso nada más.
Muchísimas gracias, Mariel. Seguimos con Heather.
Thank you very much. Buenos dias. So I'm sitting in Canada, and I just want to note that you don't want to use the Canadian case as a model or the flagship of feminist foreign policy, in spite of what the Prime Minister might suggest. In the Canadian context, first of all, it's important to know that we actually don't have a feminist foreign policy. The focus has been on a feminist international assistance policy. There have been hints that there's being work done in global affairs to do something more broad, more sort of overarching, consistent with, for example, the Swedish case. But it's not a broad feminist foreign policy, and I can tell you that it's not very feminist anyways. It's very liberal in its orientation, it's very instrumentalist, it's very weak on intersectionality with a lot of emphasis on women and girls, right? So it's sort of that kind of stuff. And I can assure you as well that the Canadian state itself is not particularly feminist, is running into all sorts of issues around military misconduct scandals, genocide of Indigenous peoples in residential schools, and the list goes on. So be careful of the sort of maple leaf myth of Canada as the standard bearer of all things that are good and noble. However, in the Canadian case, there's also a really wonderful working group that was working with global affairs. That's a combination of non-governmental organizations and academics and they're called the Feminist Foreign Policy Working Group. And they've done a series of consultations, and they've been broad, and they've been international, and they've been inclusive. And they've created what they have shared with the Canadian government as core principles in the Canadian context. So I'll just list those and then go from there. And it's not all of them, but some of them. So number one is policy coherence. How can you be a feminist when, for example, when you sell arms to Saudi Arabia? Transformational objectives. And this comes back to that question about what kind of feminism are you talking about when you talk about a feminist foreign policy? So they argue that it has to be transformational and informed by perspectives of feminist movements in Canada and around the world, right? There's a real imperial element potentially in feminist foreign policy that we need to be mindful of. It should be rights-based, intersectional, promote demilitarization, protection of the environment, and follow feminist processes and promotes accountability. So this is the work of the Feminist Foreign Policy Working Group in Canada. So I will leave it at that. Yeah, we're on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Heather. We will now have Ann Towns.
Thank you, and hello, everybody. And thank you first to the organizers for putting together this really wonderful event. It's such a privilege to be here, to speak with you, to learn from you. So on this first question, what are we talking about when we're talking about a feminist foreign policy? It's, I think this, as Cynthia Enlow said, this is a fundamental question, right, for feminist foreign policy. This is where we need to linger. And I think, so I think it's excellent that we start out with this. And in my view, there are two ways really that we can go about answering that question. I mean, one is, as the previous speakers have done here, we can think very carefully about what feminism is, right? And what foreign policy would need to look like to be feminist. And then on the other hand, we can also examine what states in pursuit of a feminist foreign policy are actually doing and address the question that way, and maybe, assess the two together. So I will try to say something brief about each of these. So on the first question, what is feminism? And to me, there's no single answer to that question, since there's such a wealth of feminist traditions in the world, right? We've already heard there's liberal feminism, and there's also socialist feminism, there's radical feminism, queer feminism, decolonial feminism, Islamic feminism, US Black feminism, intersectional feminism, indigenous feminism, ecofeminism. I can make that list really long, but you get my point, right? So in other words, feminism, I think, contains an incredible wealth and diversity of perspectives and goals. And these different feminisms entail very different views on what a just society would look like, right? Whether states are inherently patriarchal, or whether states could be used to promote feminism is but one question. Whether it's legitimate or violent to speak of women as a group at all. Whether liberal norms and institutions are necessary for gender justice, or whether liberalism, in fact, is imperialism, right, and antithetical to true feminism. So I think here, in other words, governments, they're interested in pursuing a feminist foreign policy. They have a range of options, right? There are multiple ways of doing so. And what the essential elements of a feminist foreign policy are, I think, depends on which kind of feminism a government is pursuing, right? So thus, the need to linger at this first question, what is feminism, as Cynthia started? And that takes me to the second way to address the question, namely by looking at what governments that currently are pursuing a feminist foreign policy are doing. And I'm living in Sweden, so I'm most familiar with the Swedish feminist foreign policy, of course, which has been in place since 2014. I'm not endorsing or critiquing that here, but I thought I'd just use it to highlight the elements of one kind of feminist foreign policy as one particular type, right? Because the Swedish feminist foreign policy is in essence a liberal and social democratic policy agenda that centers on gender equality, understood as equality between men and women and boys and girls in all spheres of life, and also to some extent on non-binary and trans people, right? So the policy takes the existence of men and women as groups as given. It's a given point of departure, and then it looks for and tries to address inequalities between these groups, right? It's focused in particular on empowering women and girls. So it's very women and girls focused, but there are situations in which boys and men are disempowered or oppressed as well. And then the policy is open to addressing this as well. There's also some attentiveness, not that much, but some, to the plight of non-binary and trans communities, right? And it focuses on empowering women and girls in its overarching support for what we might loosely call a liberal world order, right? A commitment to liberal democracy, free trade, and international institutions as they are, right? And this liberal social democratic nature of the Swedish feminist foreign policy, it can be seen in its organization in terms of the 4 R's, which you might have heard of before, right? They often talk about the elements of the Swedish foreign policy in terms of rights, representation, resources, and reality, right? The focus on rights involves the promotion of all women's and girls' full enjoyment of human rights, including sexual and reproductive rights. The focus on representation involves the promotion of women's equal participation and influence in decision-making processes in all contexts, right? You've heard this before, surely. This focus on the rights and on representation are in essence liberal policies, right? And the focus on resources in turn, right, involves policies to promote economic equality between men and women in terms of income and ownership. And this focus on labor markets, ownership, is perhaps where the social democratic part of the policy becomes most obvious, right? And then finally, there's the 4th R, reality, which involves making sure that the feminist foreign policy is formulated in a way that's based on the lived realities of men and women, right? And that involves taking context very seriously, relying on empirical research, empirical data to assess and develop the policy throughout. So in essence, the way that Swedish government has promoted or has developed its feminist foreign policy, it involves consistently asking about gender in all situations. Do men and women and non-binary people have equitable access to economic and political resources, for instance? What are the different vulnerabilities of men, women, girls, and boys in various contexts? Are data disaggregated by gender and so forth? And before I end, let me just point out that like the Swedish declaration of a feminist foreign policy has, you know, might not be in some ways, it's not that different from what many other states are doing. It might not be that different from what Sweden was doing prior to 2014 when it wasn't called a feminist foreign policy, right? This is kind of gender mainstreaming, gender equality in a sense. But what is different, I think, is that the Swedish government now pursues feminism supposedly in all policy spheres, not just foreign aid, but also in trade policy and in security policy. And all Swedish foreign policy actors are to pursue feminist goals. The entirety from top to bottom of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the entireties of the embassies abroad, right? So all ambassadors, all staff in more than 100 embassies around the world are to do this. So this, I think, even if the essence of it might not have changed, but the extension to new policy areas and the fact that everybody's supposed to be promoting this, this is a major shift, right? We can think lots of different things, and I have lots of, you know, perspectives on this kind of liberal social democratic feminism, but I don't think there's any doubt that this is a major transition. It's not mere words, right? This is a major reorganization of foreign policy. It can't be put in place overnight. There are huge policy conflicts here, as people have pointed out, right? This comes up against major economic interest. It comes up against security policy, right? So there's some major battles here to be had. And so I think we also need to see feminist foreign policy as a policy for everybody that's pursuing it. It takes time. It involves hard-won battles over time, right? Over many years. So it's not something, right, that one declares and then it's done. It's something that needs to be redone. And then, you know, it takes a long time, I think, to really put this in place. And I'll end there.
Thank you, Anne. And now we will hear from Marisa. Maricia.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. And yes, I extend my thanks and I appreciate being here. I mean, of course, coming at the end of this fantastic group of speakers, I really just want to say, well, just what everybody else said, really. So I'm not sure what more I can add, although I will say a few things. I mean, as others have said, this is a really important question, but it is so not a straightforward question. Or rather, it's potentially got radically different answers depending on who you ask. And exactly what Cynthia said at the beginning, much is going to depend on which part of that phrase is most important to you, the feminist part or the foreign policy part. And for me, it's a little bit like the term feminist IR, feminist international relations, even though that's my field and it's very important. The ordering of the words always concerns me because it's like the feminist bit is added on to supposedly the main bit, and that's always really problematic. So again, echoing what people have said, before we can even talk about the essential elements of feminist foreign policy, we really need to dig a lot deeper into what either of those things mean. And I was thinking about this, and I thought what I do just for a couple of minutes here is to highlight what I think we can isolate in a very simplistic way, just for these few minutes, some of the basic kind of tenets really of foreign policy and some of the overarching basic tenets of feminism, in as much as we can talk about those, as Anne has just said, it's very complicated. But I was thinking about this in terms of foreign policy, and I came up with 3 S's, right? 3 S's. One is statist. I mean, foreign policy is surely very statist, usually, you know, which brings up all kinds of questions around boundaries and borders and us and them and foreigners and threats and all that kind of thing. So it's statist. It's usually supposed to be about safeguarding, but that, of course, is usually discussed in terms of national interest. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And also, thirdly, the third S is secrecy. I mean, it's an odd kind of policy compared to everything else when it's supposed to have secret bits and we're supposed to all accept that we don't know stuff that's going on to protect the national interest. And so if we actually just thought about those three S's and then maybe compare them, not directly, but have a think about what might be three essential tenets of feminism, more or less. And I came up with 3 T's actually on this. I think I was trying to be alliterative here. And the first one is transnational. So if we think about that compared to the statist impulses of foreign policy, there's real contradictions there. Transnational feminism, surely we want it to be transnational, crossing borders, exposing boundaries, exposing, kind of doing away at some level with us and them, depending on all kinds of things. So there's a real tension there already. And then if the second one is threat. And I was thinking about that in comparison with the safeguarding idea that underpins foreign policy. And it's like the national interest, domestic interest is, the inside is often the place where women are most vulnerable. So in the sense that if foreign policy has this essential kind of issue around safeguarding the national interest, that is so often not in women's interest, and of course even less in a range of other marginalized groups. So again, a real tension there. And thirdly, someone else just mentioned this, transparency. And that's such, feminism is really, for me, I think, in terms of communication, accountability, sharing, trying to converse and have conversations, whereas this goes completely against the kind of foreign policy ethic of secrecy. So I'm really kind of just putting those out there to think about the tensions between feminism and foreign policy. And the idea of feminist foreign policy, it kind of feels right. Why would we not want foreign policy to be feminist? But we really need to consider what kinds of transformational power foreign policy can afford to have and to let, if you like, feminism do to it. So there's an awful lot of things to deconstruct and dig down deep into before we can even start thinking about those essential elements of feminist foreign policy. But yes, that's enough from me for now.
Thank you, Maricia. Well, we have such an interesting answers from all of you. I will just quickly mention that I guess the main thing is how the state is built and how we deconstruct it and how can we start building, as Anne said, a long time. It will take, but we definitely need to move into that road, at least from our perspective. And what are we going to think about when we think about feminism, and how which elements are we gonna take from all these discussions that we had in these questions? I think we have so many things to think about, but we think that the main thing here is power and how we can deconstruct the power that is patriarchal, and it's basically embedded in the foreign policy as well. Okay, so now we will move on to the second questions because we have time constraints. The second question is, what contributions can we make from the feminist theories of international relations to the design and implementation of a feminist foreign policy? Maricia, if you would like to start.
Okay. And yes, I just noticed something in the chat there actually. about slowing down. So I know that I get into a bit of a speedy mode there actually when I'm talking. So I will try and slow down a little bit here. Okay, thank you. What contributions can be made from feminist IR to the design and implementation of a feminist foreign policy? My first answer is really absolutely everything, in the sense that if anything is going to be designed as feminist, you go and ask feminist activists, scholars, whoever, somebody who knows something about feminism. You don't actually go to people who don't know anything about feminism, which I think is probably happens in lots of institutions of all kinds. So it, you know, as again Cynthia said, there's so much work that's been done, but not just in feminist IR, of course. And of course, when we think about feminist IR, again, as others have said, there's a wide range. But of course, what institutions, you know, not least international institutions, have taken perhaps too seriously is the liberal feminist end of feminism, if you like. And when we think about foreign policy, well, I suppose how I then just want to say that what kind of damage that kind of feminism does to foreign policy. And the obvious, or one obvious example is with the invasion of Afghanistan some 20 years ago now. And if the US administration at that time purposively kind of putting the First Lady out there in front of all the public and all the radio addresses and what have you, to speak on behalf of Afghan women. And so, you know, this is really problematic in terms of that sense, as Gayatri Spivak would put it in her very famous piece, Can the Subaltern Speak? The history in some ways of Western foreign policy there, and including that kind of feminist foreign policy, is of white men and women saving brown women from brown men. And so if we're looking to feminist IR to design and implement a foreign policy, a feminist foreign policy, don't go to liberal feminism is what I'd say. And also a second point, and then I'll leave it, we have to be very careful about representation, I think, because I'm thinking about the United Kingdom here, which is where I am. And Liz Truss has recently been appointed as the second female foreign secretary by the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. She's just been appointed very recently. She's also Women and Equalities Minister. But what did she do in the first week of her role as Foreign Secretary? She slashed the Women's and Equalities Overseas Aid budget by 138 million British pounds. So the fact that we have a woman as Foreign Secretary, it does not mean there's going to be anything like a feminist foreign policy. So we have to be careful about representation. And just because we have women in charge does not mean they're feminist, quite frankly. And that is really important. We in one part of the United Kingdom, though, Scotland, we do have a very different kind of leader. That's Nicola Sturgeon, the Scottish First Minister. And apparently, and listen to this, in the Scottish National Party manifesto, on page 73, and this is detail I don't usually have, so this is quite unusual for me. On page 73, it says, we, Scotland, will become the first country in the UK, joining a small number of countries across the world, to adopt a feminist foreign policy. So watch out for the design and implementation of foreign policy in Scotland. Have a little bit more faith in Nicola Sturgeon than I do in a lot of leaders in the United Kingdom, well, all the rest of them actually. So watch out for that. So liberal feminism, no. Representation, yeah, we have to be really careful about that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Maricia. Now, Anne.
Thank you. I will also try. I was also asked to speak more slowly. My answer, kind of being 5 minutes, is premised on me speeding through it. So I hope that if I speak a little more slowly, you'll have some patience that I might pull over by a minute. Okay. All right. So on this question of what can feminist theories of international relations to the design and implementation of a feminist foreign policy contribute, I will start with what feminist IR cannot do. And I think that is provide a single kind of coherent answer to what is the right feminist path to take, right? And in the extension, how should that feminist policy agenda be designed and implemented? Because again, there are very different feminist traditions within international relations scholarship as well, right? Which means that feminist IR scholars have very different things to say about a feminist foreign policy. So let me again just take the Swedish feminist foreign policy as an example. Some feminist IR scholars have celebrated this policy, endorsed it, right? Called it an ethical alternative to a self-interested realpolitik. That's the usual modus operandi in international affairs. But then you have other feminist IR scholars that have deemed the Swedish feminist foreign policy an imperialist policy, right? Claiming that it reproduces Western liberal modes of domination, and that as such, it's racist, it's neo-colonial, and so forth. So in other words, you get very different contributions from IR scholars in different theoretical traditions, right? And also, I think it's worth keeping in mind as you're seeking answers from feminist academics that the critical tradition is very strong, right, among feminist IR scholars. Much feminist work, I think, aims to, in one way or another, examine relations of power, but also needs to kind of deconstruct to expose hidden underbellies of seemingly progressive practices, including feminist foreign policy and so on. So in my reading then, there's not much feminist IR work that would align very closely with kind of public policy and that would conduct research that feeds straightforwardly into a policy process, right? Not even in a feminist foreign policy process, because most of us, and I include myself in this, keep policy at arm's length, right? We critique, we examine, we provide knowledges that policymakers can use and turn into policy, but we're not direct participants in that policy. And I think that's as it should be, right? We have different roles here. But that said, I can think of at least 3 lessons from feminist IR for the design and implementation of a feminist foreign policy. And I think these are lessons that hold true regardless of what kind of feminism that these scholars kind of endorse, right? Or what kind of feminist foreign policy one is to pursue. And the first lesson, I think, is to take context very seriously in the design and implementation of a feminist foreign policy. And this means then building a lot of autonomy and flexibility into the implementation process. So IR scholars have shown very clearly that gender relations, gender practices, the power inequalities change a lot across time and place. So to design and implement a feminist foreign policy, we have to be super attentive to the political, economic, and social context in which it is to be carried out. We need to pay attention to how gender intersects contextually with other axes of inequality like class, sexuality, ethnicity, race, religion, nationality, and so on, right? And this in turn means that a feminist foreign policy cannot be designed by the home government and the Home Ministry for Foreign Affairs in terms of a set of very concrete policies that are then to be implemented the same way, right, by embassies across the world. I think embassy staff and other implementing actors, they need to be given quite a bit of autonomy in terms of how best to pursue feminist goals in a given context. And that in turn, I think can be very tricky because with a lot of autonomy and implementation, there is a risk that the Ministry for Foreign Affairs loses control over the policy, right? You don't know how it's being done. You don't know whether it's being done, right? So building policy autonomy into the design, I think, needs to be coupled with some concrete ways of following up, evaluating, and holding all policy actors accountable for pursuing feminist goals. So accountability and autonomy kind of built into one. Then a second lesson, I think, from feminist IR concerns the importance of reflexivity. And I think virtually all feminist IR scholars, despite their differences, agree on the importance of listening to the voices of women, girls, and other marginalized groups when seeking any kind of change, right? And our fellow panelist here, Cynthia Enloe again, she has, I think, most consistently and forcefully for decades, right, called on us to do just this. Right? Hers is a call to really listen, right? To listen with an open mind, without set ideas about what inequality or oppression looks like. And that listening needs to be coupled, I think, with self-reflection, with the willingness to rethink and reassess your own role in inequality and what one needs to do to pursue a feminist foreign policy. So taking reflexivity seriously means designing the policy process so it involves listening to various stakeholders, a process of self-reflection, and then continuous adjustments of policy accordingly, right? Then the third and final lesson, I think, is not to let promotional goals that are inherent, I think, in trade and investment policy overtake feminist foreign policy as such. It is very tempting, I think, for governments that have declared a feminist foreign policy to use this as a promotional tool in the nation branding that's become so important for trade and investment policy. I mean, you know this stuff, like, look at us, we're good feminist governments, we do good things in the world, right? And so this kind of simple self-promotional messages are a key component in nation branding. But we know from feminist IR scholarship that self-promotion can be counterproductive, that it can trigger counter reactions among target audiences. And I think in a context where anti-gender movements are on the rise and gaining force, we can't really afford that, right? To be triggering counter reactions. It's much more effective then to have this reflexive stance rather than a promotional stance when pursuing a feminist foreign policy. And then I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. Heather, would you please?
So I'm going to sort of say pretty much what Anne said, but perhaps using different language, because I think we're thinking along the same lines. So when I think about feminist IR, I think there's any number of contributions that can be helpful through the process of both design and implementation. And interestingly, much of the literature that I would draw off is about sort of attentiveness, right? So attentiveness to silences, attentiveness to voices, and how in the practices and processes that are designed. But also that link, we'll go back to Cynthia Enloe here, about mindfulness about our own uncuriosity, right? So how is it that we engage in practices that are assumed to be normal, generally, you know, this is the way we've always done it, and how then do we problematize that? But to continue to problematize that through our processes. And I would also, you know, think that one of the things that when we think about, I don't know, design and implementation of any number of feminist things, right, is that idea of the feminist ethic, questions of positionality and reflexivity, I think are really important, right? So, you know, I sit in a Canadian context, I'm a settler, I'm middle-aged, I'm white, I'm privileged. And so, you know, my assumptions about what a feminist foreign policy will look like will be very different from someone across the street or across the world. And I think that that's really significant. The other thing too, and I mean, I think this is always important, but as well, because in Canada, I think our obligations around truth and reconciliation are very significant. And so I think we need to think about decolonial practices. How is it that we engage in those practices? And I will tell you, having interacted with some really amazing Indigenous friends and colleagues, there's a lot of stuff I just don't see, right? Like I literally do not see it. It is not part of my experience. My privilege blinds me in many, many ways. And so I think, again, it's a call to inclusivity in a variety of ways through the processes and practices. And the other thing that I do want to add is that when we think about feminist IR, we need to also look at sort of like who's doing the feminist foreign policy in country, right? So this comes back to, again, both who are the scholars within Argentina that have that nuanced sense of the history and traditions of Argentina with regard to foreign policy. I think that's really important. But that case in any country who's thinking about a feminist foreign policy is not to silence those who are in the country who have a certain body of expertise. The NGOs in the Canadian context are mind-blowingly amazing in terms of their expertise that they bring to the table. But also, of course, in country, in context, who it is that you're working with. And I think it is that mindfulness about context that is really significant. And I think that those kinds of collaborations can sort of disrupt some of the potentially sort of imperial and colonial practices. So that's it for me.
Thank you, Heather. Mariel, tu turno.
Sí, muchas gracias. Bueno, primero, digamos, es como que debería retomar lo que dijo Marilla, lo que dijo Ann, lo que dijo Heather. En esta implementación y diseño, sin ninguna duda, el convocar a especialistas, y cuando hablamos de feminismo y feminismos en este caso, nos obliga a no solo a observar, digamos, el proceso, digamos, no es un agregado, como bien mencionaban antes, sino es cambiarse los lentes, es ver las cosas de otra manera. Entonces, en esto, digo, por eso la necesidad de las especialistas o los especialistas que tengan una mirada feminista o una perspectiva de género. Después está esta diversidad de feminismos que nos hace decir hacia dónde vamos a ir, y yo estoy hablando de la Argentina y no puedo perder la mirada decolonial. Entonces, en esta construcción de estas políticas exteriores, si bien necesitamos el diálogo con los actores internos, movimientos sociales, que para nosotros en Argentina, digamos, son fundamentales, los organismos civiles, ONGs, ¿sí? También están los actores tradicionales, por supuesto, pero estamos hablando de la construcción de la política exterior. También si la intencionalidad es que esta política exterior se dirija a géneros, ¿sí? O sea, una política exterior con perspectiva de género, estamos hablando, cuando incluimos el concepto de género, estamos visibilizando una dominación de ciertos sectores sobre otros, y en esto las mujeres hemos sido las más perjudicadas, históricamente demostrado. Entonces, por un lado, quienes construyen esa política exterior, pero por el otro lado también saben quiénes reciben, ¿no? Porque esto del asistencialismo que viene dado por algunos países desarrollados, para los países en desarrollo, también es otro tema. Yo te digo qué hacer y cómo hacer. Se replica el estereotipo, digamos, del Estado masculinizado que le dice a las mujeres cómo va a ser esa ayuda y de qué manera. Entonces este punto también me parece, digamos, es un punto álgido para ver y para analizar. Y por el otro lado, otra de las cosas que me parece importante tener presente es en el tema de la justicia feminista. Digo, acá nosotros promocionamos derechos, llevamos derechos, hacemos que los derechos lleguen, pero cuando la justicia no funciona, y estamos hablando a nivel interno como a nivel internacional, no nos sirve de mucho. Entonces, tener una resolución 1325 que se promueve, que se ha quedado estancada, que de repente hace que haya un número un poquito mayor de mediadoras, y que está buenísimo, y que sería mejor que hubiera más, cuando de repente en esa 1325 no se tienen presentes atrocidades que se cometen a partir de los cascos azules, y los estados masculinizados no reciben ningún tipo de acuse, de recibo de estas situaciones, me parece que son elementos que también hay que trabajarlos y hay que construirlos y hay que incluirlos en estas políticas exteriores con perspectiva de género. No solo en el número, no solo en cómo se construye adentro, sino cómo se construye hacia afuera y quiénes van a ser los receptores o las receptoras de estas políticas de género que se puedan estar gestando. Eso simplemente.
Muchas gracias, Mariel. Y por último, Cynthia, Cynthia, you have the floor. Cynthia, you are muted.
Oh, sorry about that. Hi, everybody again. You know, I'm so interested. I've been taking notes. I don't know about the rest of you, but I've been taking notes like mad. But of course now how am I going to read them? I'm going to go and spend an hour deciphering all your good ideas. Let me just move to a micro frame here of what we've learned from feminist thinkers and feminist observers and feminist investigators. And that is that we should watch things over time, because that's how patriarchy sustains itself, right? Patriarchy and people who are invested in patriarchy, which includes some women and a lot of men, not all men, but a lot of men, and some women, what they do is they learn. And they will learn how to adopt the trappings, the outer trappings of feminist foreign policy making or feminist foreign policy announcing, or feminist foreign policy celebrating. They will learn how to do it. They already, in some places, as Heather warned us, are learning how to do it. And that is to sustain their way of doing things. And so I want to just talk about two things that feminist thinkers around the world have showed us, shed light on. And that is how you create a masculinized notion of credibility. I'm very interested in the politics of credibility. That is, who is believable, who is not believable. And that is intersectional, as we've learned with Anita Hill. Don't believe a Black woman. And that's in quotes. And so watch the processes of re-masculinizing something that is now being challenged precisely for its exclusivist, elitist, manipulative masculinization. And that means, I think, this is again what I've learned from all of you and from other feminists, watch the micro processes by which somebody or some group is declared or presumed to be, because declared means you could challenge it. It's presumed to be credible. Who is taken seriously? By whom? Why? With what outcomes? The politics of seriousness are always to be interrogated and charted carefully. And that brings up the politics, meaning the distribution of power and the consequences of that maldistribution of power. That's what I mean by this. The processes of creating the expert. I'm very wary of expertise. I do want knowledge. I do want experience. I do want care. I do, when it's reliable, want data and evidence. But I'm wary of expertise, especially because it is so misused to keep the foreign policy processes elitist and, as Marisha said, non-transparent and secret. In fact, expertise is what we rely on, those of us who are just ordinary citizens, to not question secrecy. Oh, the experts are handling it. We don't really need to feel excluded. And that's the process of masculinization, even as it's being challenged by so many people, including all of you who are participants, I'm guessing. You name it, you chart it, you challenge it, and those people who are still invested in that kind of exclusiveness, that kind of masculinized expertise, including some women who have fought very, very hard to become seen as experts. You know, that's how you get co-opted. All of us would like to be called an expert, but beware, beware, beware. As Anne said, who do we listen to? to become knowledgeable about something? Do we listen to a garment worker in Bangladesh to really understand how international trade works today? Or do we listen to the executive of a big apparel company like Nike? Who do we listen to? For patriarchy to sustain itself, when now being challenged by people who have feminist analytical skills and feminist foreign policy goals, we also have to watch feminization. And I know for those of you who are working in your second or third language, femininity, feminine, feminist, and feminization are really tricky to keep separate. So when I use the word feminization in English, it's a process, just like masculinization is. You know, computer programmers used to be feminized because they were, in the early days, because they were thought to be, quote, just secretaries. And then the guys figured out that they could make a ton of money if they could masculinize the technical expertise in computer programming, and you watch the masculinization of computer programming over several decades. So the process of feminization is not about feminism. It's about the patriarchal idea of what it means to be feminine. And in a patriarchal system, whether it be a foreign ministry or the Department of Physics at your university, or your local peace organization, anything can be, you know, made patriarchal. The process of feminization is to turn some people into people that others imagine to be feminine. I think like a patriarch. And if that person, which could be a man, can be seen, can be tagged, can be stereotyped as feminine, then you can feminize his or her observations, knowledge, advice, guidance, and thus you can discount that person. That's how patriarchy works. And in fact, a lot of men in foreign policy are feminized by their patriarchal male colleagues so that we don't have to listen to them giving us warnings about militarizing foreign policy or by pursuing capital maximization as a financial international strategy. So feminization is a partner in patriarchies of masculinization. And the aim is to discount people because they have alternative positions. The way you feminize somebody, usually women, but oftentimes men. Colin Powell has just died. Colin Powell was feminized by the men in the George W. Bush administration so that they could discount his warnings about the invasion of Iraq, which he eventually went along with, but not without fighting the fight inside. You can feminize anybody. And when you feminize them as a patriarchal person, when you feminize them, you dismiss them as not serious, as weak, and here's the patriarchal adjective to really kill somebody's ideas in foreign policy or any policy: naive. Not sure how the Spanish translation works on naive, but naive means not realistic, not tough, not facing the facts. And if you can do that, Soledad's smiling, so she's run into this. If you can do that, you can discount them. So in our using the knowledge, the understandings, the insights, the oftentimes gritty ethnographic based evidence that we've gained over the decades from feminist observers, which includes anthropologists, of course, watch the processes of patriarchs trying to sustain themselves by sustaining the masculinization of state policy, particularly as it relates in their relations to other states. Watch feminization being weaponized to dismiss, to discount, to just in a tokenly way listen to and then pay no attention to. Watch masculinization as a process at all levels. Watch feminization as a patriarchal process at all levels. We have to keep our eyes and ears open. Thanks.
Thank you, Cynthia. Yes, I was smiling because yes, we are accused of being naive and living in fantasy land. So thank you for your words because they are encouraging to us. So, well, now I will go just very briefly. I think one of the key questions here on the is what Marisa said on the previous questions, which is transparency and secrecy, which is really part of our work here at the Ministries of Foreign Affairs around the world. So I think one of the key issues is to work on transparency as much as possible. And as Mariel said, work with civil society as much as possible. And listening, like Anne said, listening is really key for us to be having to account in order to build foreign policy with a gender perspective. And all the intersectionality, we always talk about intersectionality at the core of the foreign policy that we are trying to build. And also we are taking intersectionality into the international forums, but we come across a lot of backlash for using intersectionality. So that's a big battle ahead that we have in the international arena, so that the intersectionality can be really part of the foreign policies around the world. And also, I think the questions about representation also it's a key here as well, and that not all women are feminists, and that we know that very well. But I think that awareness as well is part of these issues. And talking about that, I would like to also remind or tell people that in many countries in Latin America are starting to have a network of diplomats, female diplomats, and that's also really important to create awareness about what it means to be a female diplomat, and also to change that representation and the masculinization of our roles as diplomats as well, which is really a key issue here. And the big battle ahead in terms of for us to be taken seriously when we talk about having a foreign policy with gender perspective. Well, now we will move on to the last question, which is how does feminist foreign policy dialogue with other categories of international, sorry, I would say that again. How does feminist foreign policy dialogue with other categories of international relations? For instance, the global south with the north, developed countries and developing countries, and so on. Heather, you have the floor.
So I in part will say I interpret this along the lines of sort of scholarship to some extent, you know, IR scholarship, and what are the relationships there. But I also was inspired, as I often am, by some of my feminist favorite feminist IR scholars who sort of, you know, encourage us to look in different locations, take different journeys, start with things that are unexpected. So my answer to this question is going to be, when we think about feminist foreign policy dialogue, what other areas to look at? My response is pedagogy. And the reason why I say this, if we think about the themes that have come up, for example, that this is a long process, that it takes time, right? That we need to sort of challenge patriarchy and feminization. Well, oh, and I think it was Anne who also mentioned the anti-gender backlash, which we see everywhere. So with this in mind, then, the challenge is, when we look at IR scholarship around pedagogy and curriculum, what are we teaching in our classes? Those are sites of politics just as much as a bureaucracy and a boardroom. Our classrooms are not separate from the discipline. Our classrooms are not separate from voting. Our classrooms are not separate from political parties. Our classrooms are sites of the personal and the international. If we think of Robert Cox's idea that theory is always for someone and for some purpose, let's flip the script and say teaching is always for someone and for some purpose. So, you know, imagine if our students actually understood the difference between gender and women, because they don't always. Imagine if we include reflective practice, because sometimes, you know, we've all run into people who can't reflect on their own positionality. So these are things that we can include, right? If we want a transformative foreign policy, certainly we also want transformative classrooms. These are our future bureaucrats. These are our future diplomats. These are our future leaders of NGOs. They are also the people who are having conversations at home with their families. So I think we can't underestimate where it is that we think about feminist foreign policy and who it is that we encourage to think about feminist foreign policy. How and what we teach our students to see and to assume the role that they can play, I think can be about transformative potentials of feminism. It'll challenge their own views, and we challenge their own curiosity. We see the world which is gendered, and then I think that has a bit of a ripple effect. And part of this is simply to note that when you actually start looking at what we're teaching our students across the board, sometimes there's not a lot of gender. So our states can talk about feminist foreign policy, but I can tell you by looking at Canadian foreign policy course outlines that my colleagues aren't teaching it, right? So it becomes a so what as well, right? So I think there's this direct connection between feminist foreign policy and all of the design elements and reflective practice and concepts about time and challenging embedded assumed norms around patriarchy and masculinity that starts in our classrooms. So that's it for me.
Thank you, Heather. Anne, you have
Thank you. All right. Well, I very much agree with Heather's claim there that this, to a large extent, starts in the classroom. I've taken the question in a very different direction. So I think, and I hope that works well anyways. I understood it, or I interpreted it as like, how does the feminist foreign policy land or kind of enter into a world of hierarchies, these north-south hierarchies, developed and developing hierarchies and so forth, where of course the feminist foreign policy, and we've seen this, I think, in some of the critiques that have come up, right, can come to reproduce existing hierarchies in international relations. And rather than just say that again, because I think if people have read some of the criticisms of the feminist foreign policy, we've seen, you know, that critique. I would like to end, I think, on a more optimistic note, because I think there are some opportunities here. Feminism, I think, is a global phenomenon with many roots and many different manifestations around the world, right? So feminist foreign policy is something that could be and is adopted and pursued by very differently situated states across the world. I mean, we see this already, I think. Differently situated states have declared a feminist foreign policy. I mean, Sweden, Canada, France, but then also Mexico, Malaysia, right? We have Luxembourg, Spain, Argentina is clearly thinking about it, right? And then there are other states that are pursuing gender equality in foreign policy without calling it feminist as such, right? Namibia, Uruguay, Tunisia, South Africa. I mean, it's a range of very different types of states that find themselves placed differently in international hierarchies. So to me, it seems like feminisms, in a sense, can open up for alignments across global South and global North cleavages, or across East-West cleavages, across, right, the usual kind of cleavages and alignments that we see in international affairs. And I think that it provides an opportunity to have fora and in situations, contexts where foreign policymakers can really listen, learn across these hierarchies and cleavages. Right? And that means, of course, that policymakers would have to be mindful of these when designing and implementing and discussing foreign policy, and work hard not to just mindlessly reproduce hierarchies or these like tired, narratives about feminism emerging out of Europe or being a Western trait and so forth, which we know is not true and it's not the case, right? So I think, turning this into an opportunity demands a little bit of work, I think, on behalf of the policymakers and people that are pursuing a feminist policy. But I think that it is an opportunity to kind of work against some of the hierarchies at work in international affairs. I'll end with that.
Thank you, Anne. Maricia?
Hi, yeah, no, I'm taking notes madly now as well. It's so interesting, isn't it? Gosh, it's making me think all kinds of different and new things. If for this question, or my few minutes on this question, I was going to speak about some of the work done by others on feminist foreign policy, but instead I've left some of those links in the chat, actually, because all I really want to do now in this section here is just pose some questions. It's kind of one of my favorite things to do. I'm not very good at giving answers, so I'm just going to pose the questions which occur to me consequent, to these conversations here. And these aren't easy questions. There are no easy answers, but I just do want to ask the question: what would a successful feminist foreign policy look like? What would it really look like? I mean, the ideal. I mean, of course, feminism is multifaceted, but there must be some imagination, and I think that's the work of doing that is quite hard, but perhaps that would be a place to start. But then adding to that question, and I'm kind of inspired by, I have been checking the chat and Q&A a little bit, and I've seen a question from Alessandra. Hello, Alessandra. My question following what would a successful feminist foreign policy look like? What's happened to patriarchy if that happens? Again, inspired by Cynthia, and where's it gone? Or what do we do with that question? How can we think about that question? That's no answer to that question, but yeah, what does that mean? And I suppose this links to the whole thing around the anti-gender ideology and movements, which are increasing, as people have said. Of course, it's not so much anti-gender, is it? Anti-gender, it's anti-feminist, anti-queer, anti-trans. I mean, it's about, let's have gender back, but how we like it, how patriarchy likes it, I suppose, is how I put it. So what do we want our inverted commas feminism to do with foreign policy? So yeah, I'm going to leave you with all those big questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Marisa. Cynthia?
Hi, this is just great. This is like our own, super duper seminar with each other, really. So thank you for participants for bringing us all together. I would say one of the things we can do to try and create cross-region and especially cross-equality, that is inequality amongst societies, is to look at some not totally successful, but surprisingly successful efforts at international solidarity around things that really do qualify as, in the conventional sense, foreign policy. And there are two of them that I think are especially, well, I've learned from because I've been taught. And that is, first of all, the Arms Trade Treaty, which in English is called the ATT, which was formulated in 2013 after very, very contentious behind the scenes debate amongst people who want to restrain the ballooning international trade in rifles, guns, grenade launchers, grenades, and those who profit from it and also use those small arms for their own militarized local ends. And the ATT was spearheaded on the feminist side by a group called Reaching Critical Will, and which is one project of WILP, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Reaching Critical Will has published a number of available online papers about how they created a solidarity network between women from Mali, who really learned how to investigate where the guns are in local households in Mali, women in Brazil, who have organized against the use of small arms, that is guns, in domestic violence, and women in the Philippines who have lived decades now of a country swamped with small arms and the impact that has on violence against women. And they did this with a coalition that was in New York facing the United Nations. And what they got in against all the odds is Article 7 of the ATT. Now, I'm not like Marisha, I'm not a big reader of the small print, right? But of course, patriarchs depend on us never reading the small print because that's where they sustain their power. Well, in this case, feminists managed to get in to an international state-to-state treaty, Article 7, which obligates, this includes Argentina, which has signed the ATT, and many of our participants are from countries that at least nominally have ratified the ATT. In Article 7 is an obligation of any ratifier country, state, to monitor any trade in guns to the extent to which it is used in the buying country, the importing country, for use of violence against women or gender-based violence. This is an astounding thing to get into a disarmament treaty, right? But it was gotten in there by a coalition of North-South feminists who were concerned about and knowledgeable about the importation and the use of guns in violence against women and gender-based violence. The second place to look, so, you know, being an academic, of course, I always have to push books. Okay, so this is a new book that some of you, I think, are already aware of, by Ray Acheson, A-C-H-E-S-O-N, and it's called, this is a case study in how to build an international North-South alliance led by feminists, particularly indigenous feminists in Australia and the South Pacific, to prohibit, not just ban, prohibit nuclear weapons. And this treaty has now been passed. The book detailing the diplomatic, behind the scenes, not really secret, but, you know, below the radar, diplomatic efforts between North and South countries. This book is called Banning the Bomb, Smashing the Patriarchy. Sounds very rhetorical. This is not rhetorical. Look at all the pages I turned down. This is gritty, how you use feminist transnational solidarity to change career diplomats' ways of negotiating a treaty. I've never read anything like it before. But that means, I mean, it took years, a lot of persistence. You have to have a lot of stamina. You know, I mean, the suffragists around the world have taught us this. You have a lot of stamina to stick with this, but it worked. The treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. The treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons was passed by the General Assembly in 2019. It's the first of its kind ever, and it came out of the Nobel Prize winning campaign called ICAN, I-C-A-N, International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons. So it's a different kind of diplomacy. It's a North-South diplomacy. It was very explicitly informed by feminist ideas. Argentina has not yet signed it, of course. Oh, Argentina was amongst the first to sign it diplomatically, but has not ratified it in its government, right? The US, I'm sorry to say, has not even noticed that it has been ratified by 50 countries and is now operative. But there's a very good, as Heather said, there's a very good teaching vehicle, but also for all of us thinking about, can you do this? You can do it.
Thank you, Cynthia. And Mariel.
Bueno, me toca cerrar con esta tanda de preguntas. Realmente, digamos, han sido diversas las interpretaciones de la última pregunta, y voy a tomar un poquito el atrevimiento de volver a reflexionar sobre lo mismo. Digo, el tema de la educación en género me parece fundamental, si bien adentro de la Cancillería creo que esta necesaria sororidad en promover las políticas de género, ¿sí? Y el diálogo como parte, digamos, de los ideales feministas, me parecen fundamentales no solo dentro de la Cancillería, sino también desde el jardín de infantes, digo. Nosotros en Argentina venimos trabajando, y esto, digamos, se viene llevando a cabo, pero creo que se necesita mucho más respaldo, mucho más completo, y también en la Cancillería. Digo, por eso es que justamente surge esta iniciativa del seminario. Digo, no es solamente promover políticas, sino formar a los propios funcionarios y funcionarias en esta mirada y en esta interpretación. Y en este sentido, específicamente hablando de las categorías de relaciones internacionales, y como decía Anne, es necesario romper esas jerarquías, y yo creo que eso se puede hacer a partir de estas miradas feministas, que aunque puedan ser diversas, aunque sean políticas feministas, con una mirada particular o una definición particular de ese feminismo, creo que pueden desde la sororidad construir posicionamientos, digamos, en los ámbitos multilaterales, que es lo que muchos, digamos, de estas propuestas de política exterior de género promueven, ¿no? Sí me parece importante destacar nuevamente que desde el posicionamiento de Argentina, la necesidad de construir conceptualidades que terminen definiendo la política exterior desde ciertas élites gubernamentales, en el sentido de que tengan poca representación de ese público femenino, ese público feminizado, necesita sí o sí el diálogo, y en esto me parece muy importante también escuchar, digamos, las voces, si estamos hablando desde un posicionamiento decolonial, escuchar las voces de las mujeres y aquellas identidades sexogenéricas que son marginadas, y que puedan estar, digamos, incluidas dentro de esta política exterior que se promueve. Y en esto también quiero marcar otra cosa más, que son el tema de las discapacidades, ¿sí? No solamente marcar el tema de las mujeres como mujeres originarias, sino también marcar las discapacidades que también muchas veces llevan a que, más allá de que sean cuerpos femeninos o masculinos, o como se les quiera denominar, no aparecen a veces representadas en esas políticas exteriores. Si bien estoy haciendo un poco una mezcla de todo lo que se viene diciendo, me parece que en este sentido el tema de las jerarquías, particularmente que habías marcado, Anne, me parece que es fundamental para decir hacia dónde vamos. Y en este sentido, el romper las jerarquías y el romper con ciertas conceptualidades traídas en las relaciones internacionales de lo que son los enfoques tradicionales, principalmente el realismo, que es uno de los que más está establecido dentro del ámbito de la política internacional, me parece fundamental. Vuelvo a decir, el feminismo no agrega, sino que cambia la perspectiva en cómo se van a visualizar algunas cuestiones y algunos de estos conceptos, y yo vuelvo a hacer hincapié en el tema de la seguridad. Digo, digamos, desde los estados masculinizados, el concepto de seguridad está ligado al Estado. Y para la perspectiva en política exterior feminista, con perspectiva de género, el acento está puesto en la persona y en particular en las mujeres, porque el tema de seguridad para las mujeres pasa por otros lugares. Entonces, me parece que a partir de ahí hay muchas categorías que deberían ser repensadas, reflexionadas de otra manera, abordadas de otra manera, ¿sí? Y a partir de ahí, digamos, esto lleva a una planificación, no solamente de la Cancillería, sino también del Ministerio de Defensa, sin ninguna duda, ¿no? Bien, yo hasta acá prefiero dejar mi exposición, porque me parece que las preguntas que se están generando o se han generado ya en el chat son bastante interesantes, así que, bueno, muchas gracias.
Gracias, Mariel. Now, I think Mariel has wrapped up quite nicely all what has been said in this third round. Just a quick note about the importance of thinking about the international hierarchies when we think about the interaction between the global South and the North. That's really important, and also the international solidarity that Cynthia was mentioning, and the sorority, and also the reflective practices that we need to, I think they are all linked with each other. So now we will move on to the questions so that we have time for the answers. We have quite a few. I will start with with one of the first ones. I don't have the names here, but I guess the panel, the participants will know what questions I'm referring to. I wanted to ask the panelists if they could expand about the challenges that processes pose on the construction something approaching a feminist foreign policy, even assuming differences among feminisms, taking into account the practices of the state that all them mention, secrecy, self-funding, safeguarding, etc. And regarding that, if they could see a difference between a foreign feminist policy for the global South and the developed countries. If anyone would like to answer that question. It's linked to what we just said, right? It's related to the third round of questions.
I guess the first thing I'd say is you have to name it. You can't act as if all societies are equal or all states are equal. or all regions are equal when you're dealing with disarmament, or you're dealing with trade, or you're dealing with cultural cooperation. So my first suggestion to us all, and everybody has said it, you have to name it. You have to, as we say in American English, you have to fess up. You have to admit it. And that's not easy oftentimes.
Yeah, I have questions for Anne. It says, I'm doing research on my thesis on the feminist foreign policy of Sweden, and I'm starting from a decolonial perspective. And I seek to understand how this feminist policy is included in international cooperation. If we speak of an ethical change, for example, how can we think of a change in the North-South dynamic in international cooperation? And also for Anne, which advice would you give to all the young women who chose to follow the diplomatic path? Also, that question can be answered by any of you because it's very interesting.
Thank you. Those are really good questions. And I think difficult questions for me to answer adequately, like on my feet now. But so the feminist foreign policy of Sweden in a decolonial kind of framing, like how would we think of that? One thing that has struck me, I have to say, as I didn't used to know very much about the Swedish feminist foreign policy at all until fairly recently. I've had, I've read much more about it, tried to understand what it is, what it's meant, like in the nitty gritty, right? And one thing that has struck me is that, it seems obvious, right, that it's a policy that's declaring a world that's fundamentally unequal. It's, marked by kind of post-colonial relations. There are still colonial legacies. All those things are in place, right? And in the midst of that, you're declaring this policy, which can be, can serve to reproduce those relations or try to shift those relations in a sense. And obviously, I think that there's something to, any of the criticisms, right? That this can very easily be used as kind of a femo-nationalist way of like masking over the fundamental inequalities that Sweden benefits from, and that, Sweden wouldn't be where it is were it not for like kind of the colonial structures that have been in place. That said, I have also kind of been surprised by how aware, like much of the kind of in the foreign aid part of the foreign ministry, how much critical thinking there actually is there. At the same time, how many studies there are take post-colonialism seriously. They've read all the theories, right? That they're trying to integrate this into their documents and into the practices. And I'm not quite sure yet what to make of that, right? Like, is that, I mean, if we take what Cynthia was saying about kind of patriarchy reworking itself, is this, colonialism reworking itself? Is this kind of, a way of masking over, or trying to resituate Sweden still again as kind of the good European, right? The ones that didn't really have colonies, the ones that were solidaric with the developing world and so forth. Is that what this is, or is there any grain of something that we can latch onto as something that's actually genuinely moving in a different direction? So I guess that's kind of a wishy-washy answer, but to me it is, maybe my answer should be that I think it's a very good question that you're asking. And I think pursuing this and really trying to unpack and understand that will be very interesting, because I don't think the answers are straightforward. I think it'd be facile to say that this is just business as usual, right? It's just, colonial Europe being, colonial Europe, or to say this is something radically different. Sweden is an exception to all of that, right? Like the answer is neither one of those. And I think, again, as Cynthia said too, the devil's in the detail, and unpacking and rethinking like what this is and what it does in the detail and practice and context, which is not a very straightforward answer, but I think that would be my kind of immediate response. And again, like also to say that I think this is an excellent question for a dissertation or a thesis. So I'm eager to read what you come up with. And then the advice to young women that want to be diplomats. It's a question of a very different nature. I think these are very good times actually for young women to want to become diplomats, because there's a lot of momentum in a lot of places around the world now for bringing more women into diplomacy, for making ministries of foreign affairs better workplaces for women. So I think that if there was ever a good time, right, for women to join foreign services, now would be it. That's not to say that there are not still lots and lots of structures in place that haven't changed, right? And I'm sure, I mean, the panelists and the people that are listening now know much more about those than I do, right? But there's still things in place that, you know, make it more difficult for women to serve as diplomats than for most men, right? I mean, it could be anything from the lingering kind of presence of the institution of the diplomatic wife that, again, Cynthia Enloe has written about, right? Where diplomatic husbands are not really willing to step into that role. It can be things like, you know, the usual, like parental leave. Can you give birth while on duty? Can you take leave of absence when you're posted somewhere? There are a whole host, right, of policies that need to be changed for most states, I think, before it becomes feasible for women to have the same kinds of careers that men do. But all that said, I still think this is, you know, it's a good time to enter diplomacy. And I think there's a momentum for change. And I think if you enter, you should be prepared to try and make some of those changes happen too, because they're not all in place yet. I'll end with that.
You know, I'm going to jump in. I shouldn't, because I was talking too much, but I want to give a plug, a shout out to a new group, because one of the answers to tag on to Anne is if you're thinking about going into any aspect of foreign affairs, any aspect, which isn't always in the foreign ministry, be sure and network. Don't be careerist. Don't try to do this on your own as if, oh, I'll think hardest, I'll be most determined, I won't get co-opted, I won't get harassed, right? No, not me. I'm strong. Don't do it. Be all those things, not careerist. Be serious about your career, but network. And so I want to give a shout out to a group that I've just become familiar with, that I'm learning so much from. It's called, Marisha will smile at this, it's called FANEL, F-A-N-E-L, which is a play on manel, which are all male panels at conferences. This group comes out of Bucharest, comes out of Romania, F-A-N-E-L. You can find it online. They have a website, they show who's a member. And these are women who have, they're all women. They are women who have foreign policy and national security broadly defined, expertise through their own training. And they are always pushed aside in their own government's processes. And so they're now networking with each other. And they're from Romania. There are a number of Romanians, and it was started by a Romanian feminist academic in national security affairs. Romania, Ukraine, Moldova, Serbia, Hungary, that whole region, and they are feminist, they use the word experts, feminist experts in national security broadly defined in Southeastern and Eastern Europe. Look at their website. If you're in that region, join them. If you're not and you're in another region, create something like them and then ally with them. FANEL, F-A-N-E-L. Don't be alone. Don't be careerist.
Yeah. That's exactly that last, or the phrase before, don't be alone, is what I was going to say, you know, because however much what Anne said, I really agree with, this is the time, but so much will still not be of perhaps the mindset that you want to be going into diplomacy. So you are going to need your friends and your allies, because sometimes it's going to be hard, but it's going to be easier not to compromise then. I mean, there's always compromises to be made, but yeah, don't be alone.
Right, we move on to the next question. It says, one of the instruments of foreign policy is violence. I'm thinking of the United Nations peacekeeping missions or military aggressions. In my experience, the landscape of violence in ER is masculine. The troops are male. The landscape of a street in a peacekeeping mission may have women in places of high exposure to risk, but not in the place of the exercise of violence. It is a space that men jealously reserve. A city or country that is being pacified by the presence of foreign troops sees more foreign women appear on the landscape, but their presence in the direct exercise of violence is marginal. Being in these situations, I have thought that violence in international relations will always exist. But what would that instrument be like if women exert direct violence as troops on the ground? What would the feminist exercise of violence be like in foreign policy? It's a big question. Anyone would like to
I mean, just my contribution on feminist violence. I mean, not everybody agrees with me on this, but certainly my colleague, friend, and I, Ansis and Runyon, have written on feminist violence. In that, you know, feminism, it does intend to overturn structures of patriarchy, of colonialism. I mean, that's the ideal in many ways. And that, you may not want to think of feminism doing violence, but it's certainly felt as violence. And so I think, I suppose I'm not, obviously not necessarily talking about what we might think of violence on the ground, in the streets or wherever, but as a force, as an epistemological landscape, as a set of political ideas. There's certainly a lot of shaking up, structural, epistemological shaking up, which isn't, you know, which certainly can be described as violent in many ways, and certainly given backlashes and resistances is certainly experienced in that way. So I suppose I'm just saying feminism isn't apart from violence in that sense.
Yo quisiera decir algo. Me parece que mientras que esté una estructura de Estado masculinizado, hay muchas prácticas, como el tema de la violencia, que quedan como condensadas o asociadas directamente a lo masculino. Yo creo que si seguimos, digamos, en el estereotipo de que lo violento es solo masculino, seguimos mirando desde una mirada patriarcal, ¿no? Eso por un lado. Por el otro lado, me parece que el Estado tiene sistemas de seguridad y defensa militar. Esto no puede desaparecer de un día para el otro, pero la participación de las mujeres dentro de las Fuerzas Armadas considero que es un elemento que obliga a cambiar la mirada, que obliga a cambiar hasta las estructuras, la infraestructura, ¿sí? De los edificios, que hay que adaptarlos, como ha pasado aquí en Argentina, de un submarino que hay que adaptarlo a que haya mujeres, digamos, dentro de la propia infraestructura de lo que es el submarino. Entonces, me parece que la presencia de mujeres lo que lleva es a ver distinto, a integrar al otro, o a la otra en este caso, y a ver esa realidad de otra manera. Lo primero que se me representa es, muchas de las misiones de paz llevan mujeres en un porcentaje bajo, muchas de las cuales terminan siendo administrativas, y por ejemplo no patrullan. A mí me parece que el tema del patrullaje de las mujeres podría llevar a que, por ejemplo, se cometan menos delitos sexuales, o que haya menos oferta sexual, como fue lo que pasó en Haití, que es el caso que, digamos, que tengo presente o que tengo más en mente. Entonces, esto de alguna manera obligaría o disminuiría o contribuiría a, me parece a mí, a llevarlo. Obviamente con una sola mujer no hacemos demasiado, y creo que en este sentido volvemos otra vez a lo mismo. Tiene que haber una formación de género adentro de las propias Fuerzas Armadas para provocar esos cambios que queremos llevar adelante, ¿sí? Argentina en eso tiene experiencia, ha venido trabajando, y es un tema que más o menos he venido siguiendo, entonces tengo alguna idea de cómo son estos procesos, pero me parece que esto es una cuestión de educación, de formación, en el largo plazo. Pero hay que hacerlo, y hay que hacerlo en todos los, digamos, en todas las instancias, desde aquellos que ingresaron hasta aquellos que ya están jubilándose o retirándose dentro de las propias fuerzas. Y esto tiene que cruzar además las políticas de género, o las políticas específicamente, digo, la resolución 2325 todavía tiene muchas aristas para trabajar respecto de este tema. No solamente es el número, la cantidad de mujeres adentro de las Fuerzas Armadas, sino además realmente tener una mirada de seguridad distinta, y a partir de ahí creo que los cambios se pueden hacer. Digo, si miramos, y con esto termino, digo, si miramos la política internacional, en los últimos años uno dice que la mayoría de los, digamos, lo que dicen las estadísticas es que la mayoría de los conflictos bélicos no son internacionales, sino son intranacionales. Entonces es otro el proceso también de pensar en qué tipo de armamento se va a comprar, ¿sí? Si es de logística, o si es armamento para ataque, o si es para defensa, o digo, estos elementos también tienen que ver, y esto tiene que ver con los recursos y el presupuesto, que me parece que son elementos importantes, ¿no? Bueno, eso nada más.
Muchas gracias, Mariel. And I have one last question because we are running out of time. But we ran out of time already. But I have a question for Heather. I have enjoyed this discussion, and thanks to all the panelists. I agree with Dr. Heather Smith's comments about the challenges of integrating feminism into academic international relation courses, and congratulate all of those who have successfully done so. My question is, are there ways to showcase the significance of feminist foreign policy or feminist international relations, gender relations, by using experiential learning activities? Sorry.
Sure. I mean, there's all sorts of ways that you can build in the kinds of reflective practices that we hope for our students, that we want, you know. And in some ways, I try to sort of subversively train feminists, frankly, you know, so, and use those practices. So there's any number of ways to use experiential learning. Some of this, yeah, anyways, I'm just gonna say, like, all sorts of learning is experiential learning. So it depends on what the individual is looking for. The easiest way to have someone think about gender, particularly with my first year students, is just flip the script. What if you actually said male or man in this case, or masculine or feminine, right? So if you flip the script. So there was, there's an article floating around Twitter about, you know, why women leaders weren't more included in peace negotiations, I think is how it played out. And there was this line about something, how women should essentially try to, you know, induce their spouses, their political spouse, male political spouses, so it's very heteronormative, into engaging in particular kinds of activities and being more, you know, peaceful, or engaging in particular kinds of negotiations. Anyways, all I wanted to say was that if we flipped that script and reversed male and female in that particular context, how would it look like? And for me, sometimes that's the easiest way to problematize things that we are uncurious about, right? So what if you actually, you know, I said to my students, what would happen if you came out white, for example? And they're like, what are you talking about? I said, just that. Just think about that question, right? Because for so many of us, that's not something we would ever think about doing. So you can build in gender and intersectionality and diverse sets of questions in your teaching in a variety of ways, in a variety of interactive practices. The number one thing starts at looking at your syllabus. Who are you including? It's just like all the discussions on footnotes, right? You know, there's power in footnotes, but there's power in the way you create a syllabus. If you don't have, you know, Black feminists, scholars of color in Canada, you have to have Indigenous scholars speaking about Indigenous experience, because it sure as heck isn't going to come from me. So, right. So I think it's about a mindfulness and a reflexivity that we build into our own teaching that then we transfer to our students. And there's a variety of sort of pedagogical tricks of the trade that you can use to then sort of foster reflexivity and thoughts about gender and so forth. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. I'm sure it does. Okay, so we have, I think we have finished with all the questions because we ran out of time. Would you like to say a few words, each one of you, so we close the seminar?
Over to you, Soledad. Close it out.
Okay.
Yes, just thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. It's been such an interesting seminar for us. We have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of thinking to do. We are taking this mainstreaming of gender in the foreign policy very with a lot of passion, and hopefully we can come up with good ideas after this seminar. For us, it was really crucial to listen to the academics, to what you have to say about this. And we thank you all the participants as well for supporting this seminar. It's been incredible, the response that we had, and it would be posted in the YouTube channel of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Argentina. And once again, we really, both the whole team appreciates your participation, and we're really looking forward to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Great. I learned so much.
Me too.
Thank you.